Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to discuss Kantian deontology. Deontology is an ethics built from duties. Deon, literally being the Greek word for duty, is founded by Immanuel Kant back in the 1700s. At its basis, Kant believed that morality was a science and that we could determine what was right or wrong through a scientific process. The moral actions, according to Kant, were those actions that were built from reason and that were universalizable in a way that they were not contradictory. His ethics places a huge role on reason, and his philosophy places a huge role on reason. In Kantian terms, to be free is to be a reasoned, rational person. Freedom and rationality are synonymous in Kant's worldview. Because freedom and rationality are synonymous in Kant's worldview, taking a moral action means that the action must be built from autonomy and must have goodwill within it. Goodwill being defined as a respect for moral law, right? So putting it all together, morality is based on reason. Moral actions are things that are done with reasons, they're not just done from feelings. And to be free is to be living a reasoned and rational life, right? So these things together paint morality as a series of duties, right? Imagine you're someone who sees a starving person on the side of the street and you feel bad for them, so you buy them a sandwich. Kant would say that, although it was a nice thing to buy them a sandwich and it's commendable to buy them a sandwich, if your reason for doing it was just that you felt bad for them, that's not a moral reason in and of itself. Now, however, say you saw the same starving person and you felt that it was your duty to provide them with some food so that they wouldn't starve, you treated them as an ends and not just a means, then Kant would say that you had acted morally. You would have acted morally because you had used your reason to come up with your idea of treating them well. Now, it's perfectly fine that you got some good feeling from helping them, but your main reason for doing it was the fact that you used your rationality and came to this conclusion, right? So when Kant's talking about moral actions, he's talking about a very, very specific type of action. That is an action done from reason, not an action done from emotion, right? So any actions done from emotion are immediately discounted as moral actions. Now, Arthur Schopenhauer, who was another sort of contemporary to Kant, would say that Kant's wrong. Schopenhauer says that moral actions have to come from genuine loving kindness, and that if morality was just a series of cold calculated duties, then the word itself would have no meaning, right? However, Kant would counter that it's not the case that people shouldn't feel feelings, right? He believes that you should feel feelings, but for something to be a moral action, it has to come from that respect for moral law, right? You have to want to be a moral person and want to do the right thing. Which brings us to the hypothetical and categorical imperative. Hypothetical imperatives are imperatives that are goal-focused, and they typically follow an if-then format. If you're hungry, get you something to eat. If you're thirsty, get you something to drink. If you want to make a lot of money, become a medical doctor, so on and so forth, right? It's if-then. Hypothetical imperatives, in most cases, aren't even built towards moral ends. They're mostly non-moral choices. It could be anything you're trying to make a choice about that is not moral. However, categorical imperatives, they're a whole separate class on their own. They're commands. They're short, distinct. Do not kill. Do not steal. You should help the sick. You should help the starving, right? They're not set up in an if-then format, right? So we got to remember, a categorical imperative is not the case of if you want to be good, then you do this. A categorical imperative is a command, right? That word imperative, it's a command for you to do something. However, you could reasonably say that, you might want to start every categorical imperative with if you want to be moral. But Kant assumes from the get-go that you do want to be moral because being free is synonymous with being moral, right? So if you want to be a free person, you have to be moral. And you're only free if you're living a reasonable, rational life, right? So categorical imperatives. Now I'm going to talk about Kant's interpretation, Kant's three formulations of the categorical imperative. I'm going to talk about those, but it is also a class of action, right? So anything that could be a moral choice will be put through a categorical imperative, right? And with categorical imperatives, they have to be universalizable. And whether something is or isn't a good categorical imperative will depend on whether or not it can be made universalizable and still be consistent. So for example, say that you desperately need money and you know you won't be able to pay it back. So you decide that you're going to lie to your friend and have them give you money because you know your friend will be able to afford the loss, and you know that your friend will not hound you for the money. You know you won't be able to pay it off, but you make a false promise that you would. Now, let's say that we turn that into a universal maxim. We said it's morally okay for people to make false promises to get money when they need money. If that was the case, then the whole institution of lending and borrowing would become non-existent. People would not be willing to lend to people even at outrageous interest rates because they would know that every person who was coming to borrow money from them had no intention of paying it back, right? So that's one way. Let's use another example. Let's say you are driving down the road and someone comes up behind you and they're tailgating you pretty aggressively. So you take out a rocket launcher and you fire it at their car and blow them up. If we were trying to make that into a categorical imperative, we'd say it's okay to shoot someone with a rocket launcher if they follow us too closely. Now, when you try to make that into a universalizable maxim, you run into some problems. That would create a situation on the roads where anytime someone was following too closely, the person in front of them might take out a rocket launcher and blow up their car. The roads would become too dangerous. It's inherently contradictory, right? You wouldn't want to drive on the roads if you knew that at any moment the person in front of you might take out a rocket launcher and blow up your car, right? So that's how this imperative, this categorical imperative formulation works, right? Because Kant says that when we're forming these categorical imperatives, we have to make universalizable maxims. We have to make rules that would be the general rule for all people, right? We have to imagine that if everyone had the same rule, what the outcomes would be. And in cases of contradictory maxims, a maxim could be contradictory in will, or it could be contradictory in itself. If it's contradictory in will, that would be like the maxim of you should never help anyone, right? That's contradictory in will because at some point in your life, no matter how self-sufficient you are going to need help from someone, right? So you as a willing individual would not want that to be a maxim. And then contradictory in itself, we think back to the lending and borrowing example. All people will need to lend or borrow at some point. And if the institution of lending and borrowing was rendered non-existent because everyone decided it was okay to make false promises, then that would be contradictory in itself. You can't have lending and borrowing if everyone's making false promises. Of course, we do have a couple of problems when it comes to these maxims. One is the problem of relevant descriptions, or put more simply, there's lots of ways you could phrase a maxim. For example, in our money lending scenario, we could try and make our maxim as narrow and specific as possible. We could say, instead of saying it's okay to make a false promise, we could say it's okay to make a false promise on a Tuesday when I'm talking to my friend who's a millionaire and I need money and don't have food and yada, 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 right? Kant would say that is a bit of an unfounded claim. And in my example, I did exaggerate it a bit. But when it comes to making something universalizable, it is a genuine question. It's still argued a bit about today of how specific can you make it? Is it okay to be rude to someone who's being rude to you? Is it okay to be rude to someone who's being rude to someone else? Right? We could make a maxim that says it's never okay to be rude, but what if it's a case where someone such as a waitress is getting harassed by a customer? Would it be okay to step in and be rude to the harassing customer to save the waitress? Could we make a maxim out of that, or would that conflict with our maxim not to be rude, right? And Kant takes these maxims pretty seriously. So, there's a famous question that was posed to Kant, which is, would it be okay to lie to a murderer who was chasing your friend, right? And the setup is pretty simple. Your friend comes to your house seeking to hide because a man is after them with an axe. The friend hides, and the man with the axe comes to the door and asks you, is your friend here? With the intention of murdering your friend. Would it be okay to lie to this murderer? Kant would go so far as saying, no, it's not okay to lie to the murderer. And his reason being that perhaps your friend hears the murderer at the door, so they try and run. You tell the murderer that your friend's not there, so he starts walking off to leave, and then bumps into your friend. Well, at that point, you'd be morally responsible because your action had played a part in it. You hadn't done the morally right thing. Now, of course, in this situation, it's a bit tricky, right? Because there's lots of things you could do. You don't have to open the door to talk to the murderer. You could keep the door shut, right? Maybe that could be a maxim. Keep the door shut if there's axe murderers at the door. The main point is that for Kant, these maxims are serious business. They're not just flits in the wind, right? And to help us understand how to use these maxims, he reformulated the categorical imperative 3 ways to try and help guide us in our moral action. So I'm going to read them off to help you, the viewers. So the first, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. So what Kant is saying is that when we're deciding our rules that we're going to live by, when we're deciding our maxims, we need to make sure that they can be universal. It can't just be, that example from lying on a Tuesday to get the money when you know that they won't miss it, and yada, 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 right? It has to be something that can apply in every situation. Next, act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. So what's this mean? Well, Kant argues that we have inherent human dignity, right? You can't buy a human being's dignity. You can't buy their worth. So acting in ways that would deprive them of their dignity, such as taking them as a slave, or abusing or haranguing them, or committing some sort of cruelty towards them, that would be immoral because we have treated them as an object and not as a person, right? Because as a person, they're due human dignity, they're due human rights. And then third, act in accordance with the maxims of a member giving universal laws for a merely possible kingdom of ends. So what Kant is saying is that we have to act as though the moral laws we're making are going to lead towards this hypothetical kingdom of ends, this hypothetical utopia where every person treats every other person as an end in and of themselves and never as a means, right? So with each of these, he's explaining to us how the categorical imperative works and how we should use it. And that's a very important thing for us to know when it comes to understanding his philosophy. Each of these are an important part, right? And they each highlight different ways that we interact with each other and interact with society. Now, when it comes to never using someone merely as a means to an end, let's examine that a little bit more deeply because we've talked about the first one. But let's talk about the second one with a bit more detail. What does that mean? Does that mean you can never hire a plumber? Does that mean that you can never, hire a mechanic? How do you have someone help you with something if doing so would make them a means to your end. Well, Kant would say that when we're making someone a means to our end, what we're doing is making them change their purpose to suit our purpose. So think of the slavery example, right? When someone is made a slave, they no longer have autonomy and freedom over their life. However, if someone is, say, a plumber, and we call them up to fix our pipes, their goal, if they're a good plumber, is to be the best plumber they can be and to earn money in the market to support their family. Our goal is to get our pipes fixed and to pay them the money that they need as a plumber, right? So we have two goals that are in synchronicity with each other. The goals are, aligned with each other, which is a very good thing. If, for example, we had captured the plumber and was holding him prisoner to fix our pipes, then we wouldn't have goals that were in synchronicity, right? Their goal would be to try and escape, but we're forcing them to do our plumbing, right? And when it comes to this third one, the kingdom of ends, right? This is something Kant talks a lot about, this idealized kind of hypothetical, peace on earth situation where we've all morally evolved to the point that we've put a lot of the feuding and squabbling behind us. We see this in his Metaphysics of Morals when he talks about how states should interact with each other, and we see this in his writings on perpetual peace with his ideas for how a world government could be structured to prevent war. When we're acting in accordance with each other to create universal laws, what Kant is saying is that all rational people will feel the same way about the important moral issues. And if they're all properly using their freedom, and they're all using their reason, and they're all acting in a way that is in accordance with that reason, right? They've got respect for the moral law, then Kant would say that it's a done deal. We're going to get to that kingdom of ends. It's also important to note that this makes a very important point. Every rational person is their own lawgiver, right? Now, of course, if you live in a country, you follow their laws and yada, yada, yada. But your decisions on whether to do that, how to do that, when to do that, that comes down to you. You're the one that makes that your goal, to follow the law, to be moral. That's not something that just comes out of the blue, right? So as you keep all these things in mind, remember, never treat someone as merely a means to an end. Always hold respect for the moral law. Always try and stay rational. And if you have a moral issue, always try and think it through to come up with the right universalizable maxim to allow you to act morally. And it's important to say that these maxims will look different than what you learn about in, say, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was a bit of a response to deontology, right? So the utilitarian will say to us, do that thing that provides the most utility. So for example, if you think of the trolley problem, you've got one person on one track, five on the other. Utilitarian would say in every case, you want to hit that lever, save the one person. Kant would have a different answer. It might be the case that you could justify hitting the lever to save one person, but is it up to you to make the decision? That's a tough call. Do we want to live in a world where every person is the arbiter of life and death? I don't know. Do we? And for those of you who think this is a bit too esoteric of an issue, let's think about it another way. When it comes to the education of children, if we look at it from utilitarian calculus, we should spend our money in the way that provides the most benefit for the most people. Some children have special needs. Some children, no matter how much school you put them through, they're never going to get above a certain level, say a fifth grade level, right? They're never going to contribute to the economy. They're never going to better the civilization. In fact, in many cases, they might be a burden on resources. The utilitarian would say, well, it would be for the greater good if we use those resources on others and, just provide a palliative care for these people with the intellectual disabilities. Whereas Kant would say that these people have an inviolable human dignity and that we wouldn't want to live in a world where there was a maxim that said we shouldn't teach some children, right? Kant would say that we want to make it a maxim to teach all children, for example. And to violate that would be to violate the moral law, which would be contradictory, right? So we can see with this small example how a Kantian and a utilitarian are going to come to different sides of the same issue. For example, the issue of special education funding. But we can see it in terms of military actions. Is it okay to torture someone to try and stop a bomb that's about to go off? A utilitarian would say, oh yeah, if it's going to save more lives, torture them away. A Kantian would say that that person has an inviolable human dignity, one. Two, you can't guarantee the torture is going to get you the information. And three, we wouldn't want to live in a world where people could get swept up and tortured if there was a thought of a bomb. Because going back to the bomb maker example, it could very well be the case that there is a bomb, but it could also be the case that they grab the wrong person, right? What happens if you grab the wrong person? Well, that's sketchy. And do we want to empower government officials? Do we want to empower people in our society to commit acts of torture? I don't know if we do. That seems kind of sketchy, right? So again, we see the difference between the utilitarian and the Kantian. A different take on human rights, a different take on justice, a different take on moral principles. But let me know what you think. If you're watching this video online, or if you're one of the students in my class, leave a comment, post in the forums, let me know what you think. I am really excited to hear your thoughts. I love talking about Kant. I did a master's and doctorate, both basically focused on Kant, so I'm actually really excited to talk about it. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful day.